Hi, this is Al Adamsen, founder and executive director of the Talent Strategy Institute. Thank you for joining us this morning to listen to Dave Weisbeck, the Chief Strategy Officer of Visier. Dave and I are going to have a quick chat about him and his background and what they've been doing at Visier over the past several years. And he has done some great things, and given his background, I think you have a great session coming up. Dave, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
All right. Well, again, thanks for joining us today. You and I have known each other for a few years now, met first at HR Tech when you launched your product, and since then you've had a great trajectory. So congratulations on making that happen. Tell
Thank you very
me,
much.
if you would, just a little bit about your background, because I know you're with Crystal Reports and Business Objects. So the data visualization and business intelligence space is very familiar to you, and that's arguably been the basis for a lot of your success. So just give me a little taste and the audience a taste of your journey and how you got here.
Yeah, happy to. So I guess if there was a theme to my resume, if you think about it in those terms, it's definitely been this idea that data, that information has a tremendous amount of value for organizations. And so I've been working for the last 20 years about helping organizations to unlock that value that's hiding in that information. It goes back to, as you called out, a product that hopefully is familiar to a few of you, Crystal Reports, and helping to create that. And then transitioning through companies like Business Objects, where, as I like to put it, we were the largest independent business intelligence company that's ever existed, and then ultimately into a company that I'm certain everybody's familiar with, SAP, where at SAP I was responsible for the overall analytics business that we had. It was my job to figure out how to make people more successful in the use of that information. And that transitioned into Visier, where we had this idea that the real gap for people to be successful wasn't so much in making a really powerful tool, it was delivering a focused solution. And when we thought about where to focus, of course we came back to people, which is the heart of every company, and the success of every company always goes back to your people.
Sure, absolutely. And tell us a little bit about Visier, because obviously you all haven't been around all that long. That being said, you've made significant inroads in the space and created some significant excitement. In fact, most anyone who's looking at a tool has you on their short list. So, how did you achieve that mind share with this community so quickly?
Yeah, I like to joke sometimes that by age of the company, we're a toddler, although we're very quickly transitioning into a kindergartner. So we're just about 4.5 years old by technical age of the company. So what's kind of our story, and why did we do this, and where have we gotten the success from? I think it comes back to the what's happening in terms of a change in, as we look at the workforce and what's changing in terms of the HR world. And I'll talk about that as I get into some of the presentation. But that change, I think, is as we saw that, and people recognized just as we did, that all success in organizations tracks back to the people. What we recognized is that the HR departments were going, wait a minute, we don't have the insight that comes from the data. But it's very, very difficult for us to be successful because the data is in multiple systems. We have an ATS, we have our engagement surveys, we have our HRIS. I mean, you could go on and on. And so that provided an extra hurdle. Plus, we haven't been challenged as a function to really be data savvy. And so there was a skills gap as well. And so we said, well, what if we took a solution approach to that? Rather than giving you a pretty tool, we started with what are the most important business questions and delivered that to you. Wouldn't that be more impactful and exciting? And so far, at least, the history is showing, the short history is showing that that's working. And then the last piece I'll just quickly add in is to round that out. What we also recognized is understanding your past is wonderful. Being able to articulate precisely the different future you want to create, that's how you really create impact in the organization, and that's what we call planning.
Sure. Outstanding. So I'm hearing that you're not only looking at the rearview mirror, so to speak, and which metrics are reflecting what happened in the organization or what's happening currently, your future focus insofar as what's the future demand for talent, or do we have the right supply either internally or bringing them in externally? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and bringing them in, and the way I often put this too is if you think about, okay, we have a particular business strategy we need to implement, and we need to figure out what are the right people to be successful. Okay, great. Now, if I give you infinite resources, that's an easy problem to solve.
Yep.
You can hire the best talent in the world. You just pay them ridiculous so that they can't turn you down. So you always are having to make these decisions in balance against, yes, but what will it cost us? And so giving people very clear insight to that trade-off
Yep.
of yes, but at what cost or what ROI for this investment in people, I think is a place that, again, as a function, we haven't had as much of a focus on. We've often let really finance lead that discussion, and we think it's time for a change.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Well, thanks for that. So, the attendees who are here this morning, just so you understand how we're going to spend our time together, Dave and I are having a quick discussion about who he is and who Visier is as an organization. And we're going to wrap this up shortly and allow him to get into his presentation on the datafication of HR. And that will go for about 30 minutes. And then we're going to have a Q&A with everyone who is participating. So as Dave is speaking, don't hesitate to pose a question through the chat section on your screen. Also, I'm going to be launching a poll right now about what is your biggest challenge regarding standing up a workforce planning and analytics capability in your organization. So if you would uh, respond based on your experience in your organization, and if you're not saying it, please let me know via the chat. But the selections are leader understanding, vision, focus, and resource allocation. In other words, if that's a barrier, leaders just don't understand what this is, please select that. The capabilities or lack thereof of HR business partners to facilitate this process. Number three, the lack of capacity or capability of workforce analysts. I imagine most of the people on the call are in fact workforce analysts, so I don't expect a lot of that being selected. The inadequate measures throughout the employee life cycle. So are we measuring the right things in the first place? And finally, is it a technology challenge insofar as the lack of ability to aggregate and analyze data? So I'll let you have a few more seconds to respond, and we'll see where we land. So I'm going to close the poll now. And Dave, I will share these results with you because I don't know if I can share them. Most 57% regarded it as a technology challenge. 29 which percent viewed it as a lack of leader understanding, and vision, focus, and allocating resources. And 14% regarded it as challenges within the HR business partner community. No one selected lack of capacity or capability among the analysts, so the know-how is certainly there. And the inadequate measures throughout the employee life cycle, surprising to me, no one selected that either. So the bulk of the respondents were in the, hey, it's a technology challenge. So you might want to respond to that as you go through your slides here.
Yeah, and the other way I describe what I've been doing for the last 20 years is certainly I've been a technologist. So it is somewhat music to my ears to hear that people think technology is at the heart of the issue, because that's what we're trying to solve for. It is a little surprising though that on the HR business partner side, because that's a very common theme that we see, that it's the horse to water kind of analogy.
Yep.
If you just give them the really great data and the insights, then they'll lap it up and they'll love it and they'll come back asking for more. We don't see that nearly as much as we'd like to see that. So that's maybe an interesting point for conversation as well.
All right. Take it away, sir.
All right, great, thank you. So what I want to talk about is what we call this idea of the datafication of HR. And it is to this notion as we think about that. There is a tool technology kind of side of this, but there's often a very strong people side about this. Thinking about the cultural change as well, and challenging what it means to really be data-centric. The notions of, can we get a report versus can we get analysis? There's these distinctions. So that's really what I want to talk to you about today. And what I like to do in these types of presentations is I want to ground everybody in some the theorems behind this. What is the ideas? What is the context? But then I like to transition and give you practical information. What I always find is that people like to go to these with the idea that I'm going to learn something that I can take back, whether it's today or tomorrow or next week. Maybe it doesn't matter so much, but there's something practical that you can apply. So I'm going to try to make certain there's a lot of that towards the end that turns the theorems into practicalities. But let's start with the theorem side of what's really driving this change so that we have that context in mind and a shared point of view. So what's driving the datafication of HR? From my point of view, it is a first point I would make is it's really about a lot of change that we see about the way the workforce and the workplace. I like to make that distinction between the two, the way that we have seen change. Change is the old joke, is the only constant, right? And so the workforce and the workplace have been always changing. But what I think is different now is the pace and scope of that change. And so as we think about the way the workplace has changed, we've become 24/7 businesses, global operations. We also have these, thanks to largely technology, this fading time and place boundaries. We're all connected back to the workforce, whether it's because we can log back into our networks or because we have our smartphone. And even in this case right now, we have a faded time and place. We're in different time zones, we're in different locations, and yet we can still collaborate. So, and the environment for risk and compliance has got more complex. We tend to make more laws and regulations, not less. But the workforce itself is also getting more complex. Contingent workforces, the idea of global mobility. And historically, you put ads for the talent in the newspaper, and you hired people who read the local newspaper, and there was a small number of companies that put it in national papers for these big roles. Now we all operate in a very much a fluid workforce of time and space of where they are. Plus generational divides, which has maybe been more of a constant, and offshoring. It's not even new anymore for most of us. It's just a standard way that businesses operate. In completing that picture, the new technologies that have come in, cloud-based technologies, social media, and how that is on recruiting, for example, has fundamentally changed the way we do that. And then we can never forget that from a HR point of view, we're a cost center. We're often reminded of that. And so every function needs to justify itself in an ROI, but when you're seen as a cost center, that challenge becomes even greater. So in all of this, how do we be successful? And so how do we make that transformation of HR? And here, in this case, a lot of the things that we've been focusing on for years remain kind of the constants. And so the point I'd pull out of this is that because of this increasing complexity, because of the need to still be successful at these fundamental drivers of getting the right talent and developing that talent, those challenges have now become harder. And so in the face of that increased complexity, how do you gain the advantage the data will give you? Or how do you de-risk the decisions that you're now making? Data can play a fundamental role in allowing you to be more successful, even in a more complex environment. And so this is one of the core drivers that we see for this need of the datafication of HR, and that's why we consistently see planning and analytics as a top 3 investment from HR organizations. But ultimately, what it really tracks back to is, a statement like this. What people have made the connection on is that it's not just about HR organization and function being more successful, it's about the business being more successful. And so people have made the connection that applying a data-centric approach about talent has business impactful results. The classics: revenue, profit, shareholder price. So there's some great studies actually the Boston Consulting Group did on those companies that focus on their people have better stock market returns. And so people have made that connection around this is a necessary investment that we need to make. And there's lots of other data points here, a couple I've called out from different organizations that you might trust more or less, so you have to pick the one you like here. that those who make these types of investments, they are successful. They are more successful, and again, in business results, not just in reducing turnover or lowering attrition or shortening the time to fill, but in those business impactful results of revenue, customer satisfaction, these kind of notions. So where are we today then? So if that's the context of us in terms of what's driving us to make this change, and we can see the results that we get from a business perspective, where are we? Is this something we all already agree with and we've already done, and we're already all on the same page? At least from the polling that we've pulled from research, and I'll share some results as well. At least I'll speak to them of ones that we've done ourselves, looking at where organizations are from a maturity point of view. How are we doing? And so this is a particular model that comes from the Burson organization. We'll just try to break out in 4 simple levels a maturity curve, starting at, of course, least mature, very reactive, to most mature, and really excelling even at the use of things like predictive analytics. What you see on the right-hand side in the bubbles represents where people have self-selected as the capabilities that their organization has. And so what you see is, for me, actually not too surprising, but the magnitude of the people at the lowest levels versus the highest levels certainly was surprising. Any maturity curve will have more people as less mature than at the highest levels, but it is still a little surprising here that just with the scope of how many people are at the beginning levels of really using data. And so we see 56% of people kind of still on that reactive side, only 1 in 25 really hit those higher levels of predictive.
Dave, if I might ask a question on this, do you view these as linear? In other words, does one step lead to another, or can an organization do strategic analytics or predictive analytics based on the existing data that they have and still be reactive? So in other words, these things can be going on at the same time in a particular organization. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we actually have a slightly more sophisticated model here that tries to track capabilities that people have. So if you think about predictive analytics as a capability, we have a smart IO psychologist on board who's familiar with a predictive tool, and they can do some of that. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of a capability side. But then we also think about it in terms of reach of users. Because if you're not getting the information broadly out to stakeholders, you shouldn't really be considering yourself mature. And so we think about it from that perspective. We think about it also in terms of your reach of data. Our IO psychologist does some really fabulous stuff with their engagement surveys, but none of our recruiting, none of our attrition, none of our cost of our workforce have we ever really analyzed. And you can't really call yourself sophisticated. So we look at it in those 3 kind of buckets. And what we're always coaching people to do is make certain that you're not getting one of those aspects too far out in front of the others. And so it's not completely linear, to answer your question, but you do often see capabilities or different approaches people have taken where they kind of jump a couple of levels in one of those kind of capability areas.
Right.
And to repeat myself, our coaching is to keep them relatively balanced.
Got it. Thank you.
The interesting one for me on, as well as this is we did our own survey on this as well, and the numbers came in almost identical, like just small percentage adjustments to each kind of category. What we asked, though, as a follow-on question was for people to give us some insight of where they're intending to be in 24 months. And we asked that 6 months ago, so 18 months from now. And it was completely flipped. So where you have a 4% who's predictive, in 18 months, people are intending to be, only 4% still stuck at reactive. So it's a good kind of test on, is this important to people, and are people trying to make this change?
Super interesting.
So how do you make the move then? So if I've done this correctly, I've all convinced you that this is really important. Perhaps I didn't need to, but you already have an understanding of how critical important this is. So how do we make this change? That becomes the real struggle for a lot of organizations. The way I think about this, and And I'll try to make this as succinct and clear. It's a little bit, there's some complexity to the notions here that I'm trying to share. But the core of the idea is that today a lot of organizations from an HR point of view are built to be very reactive and in service orientated. So rather than protect and serve, it's react and serve. And so the business needs come in as kind of business demands. Hire somebody, deal with this compliance issue, help me to put in the right training programs, whatever the case may be. But it's very reactive. So you get request and you react. The way we structured organizations is in line with that. We have people to serve those business demands. So somebody who takes care of the compensation and the talent acquisition. And then we've implemented the systems that support these particular activities. It's all nicely logical. It makes a lot of sense that we have built out the function to react to the demands that are coming in. The nice consequence of which, as we think about how that has left us, is with tremendous data for us to be able to use to try to make a transformation here so that rather than just request and then react, which doesn't go away, but we can make a transformation to use that information to make a change, make an impact to the business. And so the way that we like to think about that is this notion of really empowering in the organization, kind of starting on the right, going left on this slide, so reading it a little backwards, really thinking about empowering this notion of somebody who's responsible for what we would call workforce intelligence in the organization. Folds together the ideas of analytics and planning and really using as a head of intelligence on your workforce in the organization, where what that person is really fundamentally focused on is all of that great insight that you've had, feeding that back in to change the direction of that request. So now rather than reacting to business demands, you're really having an impact into the business strategy. And the business strategy is not in hire somebody and keep these people. It's in the business drivers, margin and customer satisfaction, and that our organization is expanding geographically. These aspects. And the way that we think about that is insight should inform what you're trying to achieve, your people strategy, which captures your intent, what it is that you intend to do. And from that intent, in implementing that, turning that into action, you will create an impact to the success of your business strategy. So it's how do we turn that loop around of those business requests into advantage for our organization. As a really quick example, if you think about as a business strategy for your organization might be if you're in pharmaceutical or high tech or telecommunications, these types of industries, innovation is maybe at the heart of your business strategy. We need to bring in the right talent that can help us to continue to innovate. So that's at the heart of your business strategy. From a people strategy perspective, that might mean becoming an employer of choice. How do we become a top 100 employer so that our employee brand is strong enough to attract the talent and keep it that we need to make certain we have that great innovation in our organization? The insight informs you about where are you today, where do you need to focus, what changes do you need to make, and then if you're successful, you will have a real impact to your business strategy. So this is the heart of the change that we would think about as in terms of the transformation function. So how do we get a little bit more practical then? If we think about that datafication, the way we think about it is you need to really move beyond thinking about it metrics. Another term I often use is reports. As you think about it, it's kind of moving in maturity left to right here a little bit. Metrics, system, standard of measure, the granddaddy of all HR metrics, of course, being turnover. A lot of people are fixated on that, making certain that we can get a dashboard with metrics in it or create a report to service business demands. Analytics, though, takes that notion further. It says what we really need to be doing is connecting an analysis with that information. As an example, not about the turnover metric, it's about more profound questions like who is at risk of leaving? And so getting to these more profound insights. As you transition then to this idea of that insight to action loop, so now we've got the insight, we understand who's at risk of leaving. As you transition to planning, you're turning that insight into action, and the actions might be, well, what do we do to take, what are the actions we'll take to minimize the risks of departures? So this notion of, and now we know what we're going to do, and we can track and measure that we're doing what we said we would do to create the impact that we're trying to take. So this kind of cycle then is how we think about this datafication of HR. And the notion of being very practical, I want to go through some examples with you of trying to make
Muted.
and how your approach can be different to being successful. So let's talk about the first one, acquiring talent in the organization. So there's this notion that is relatively common and in a lot of different areas, but it certainly applies very strongly in the notion of acquiring talent. And it's this idea of, good, fast, and cheap. Pick any two. Invariably, everybody wants all three, but you can't have all three. So if you want good and cheap, then it's probably going to take you a long time to find. But if you need good people but you want to get them fast, well, okay, let's go use recruiting agencies and pay those extra fees, so it won't be cheap. If you want fast and cheap, we'll hire whoever walks in off the door, and probably not going to be good, right? So you're always going to have to make these balance and trade-offs. And so, this is one of the big contexts that those who live in the world of talent acquisition really understand. Some of the complexity here, though, relates to the fact that as we think about recruiting and talent acquisition, it's a process with a lot of moving pieces. And it's not always the case that the business leaders even understand that. So what we often find is people are fixated on poor metrics. Time to fill being, if turnover is the granddaddy in the kind of the attrition side of the house, on the acquisition side of talent, it's certainly time to fill. And it doesn't really tell a very good story. And so we see a lot of dashboard, and a perfectly fine dashboard. And in fact, it comes from Visier, so I have to say it's perfectly fine. But it's not very great in terms of it's really telling the story of what people are trying to achieve when it comes to move the needle in their acquisition of talent. And people can get over-fixated on an individual metric like that time to fill. And so part of this transition that people need to be thinking about it being more analytical and moving from this kind of metrics view to a more analytic view is a couple of changes that relate to telling the fuller story and not being fixated on one thing that masks the fullness of the story. And so what we like to think about is particularly the use of visualizations, not because they might be pretty, not because you get kind of people, who are sitting down on their laptop and not paying attention in the meeting, kind of will look up and pay attention because there's something more interesting on the screen.
Unmuted.
Because they can relate a more complex situation succinctly. It's very simple. It's a picture's worth 1,000 words. If a picture's worth 1,000 words, then in a visualization might be worth at least 100 metrics, for example. So as a quick example in this case, the story that you're trying to tell is that from a talent acquisition perspective, that is a process with multiple stages. And while to the example on the screen, time to fill is still related here and something we'd want to understand, what's more critical to relate is, well, is there gaps in the process as we're moving candidates through? Is there to the good, fast, and cheap, what is the effort required? So in this case, we're fixated on the 369 that we filled and looking backwards and saying, what did it take for us to get there, so that we can relate core ratios like how many applicants are we needing to fill a given role, and how many interviews does it take for us to fill, because that gives us a sense of effort. So when you have a next question or a conversation with a business leader and you're talking about why haven't we filled this role, or why can't you hire this person faster, that you can give them the larger picture of here's what it takes and here's what's behind it in order to get to the end, and have a more meaningful conversation about, and are you prepared to invest to change these dynamics to achieve that end? So you're willing to put in the money, so to speak, so that you can get both the good and fast aspects that most business leaders are looking for. So the idea here is that it's trying to relate that larger picture. A couple other pieces of information here that relate cost, and you'd also want to be able to cut this, of course, by different sources you might be looking to hire from, or different roles you're bringing into the organization. But the critical point for me is that to that notion of a picture is worth 1,000 words, visualization can tell a fuller story that allows you to be more thoughtful in the decisions you're making with data. So, and the same kind of thing kind of follows through in terms of relating those different aspects here as you're thinking about it from kind of a speed or quality of hire perspective. You have different questions that you're going to want to relate that look at things like, to that notion of the good perspective, are we keeping people? So again, here in this particular view, we're cutting the information by the time to fill, and that's what the main blue view here of information is. And now we're trying to answer the follow-on questions like, okay, do we have a relationship between how fast we're filling people in the organization and the information that tells us about how good those people are, the quality. So looking at turnover in the first year or looking at turnover in the first 3 months of service within the organization. So these types of extra complexity and sophistication to the types of analysis is part of at the heart of what we see is that transition from being more reporting and metric-centric to being more analytic-centric. So let me talk about another example then, which is this notion of keeping talent, so the attrition side to go with the pairing with the acquisition side. So as we all think, I'm certain given where this team is in terms of how they answer some of the question and it relates to some of the barriers, it probably doesn't need much setup for me to talk about the idea that turnover is really not a very good metric. It doesn't even distinguish between what's regrettable or not, doesn't distinguish between voluntary and involuntary, these basic notions that we should really be looking at as we're trying to understand our ability to keep our best and brightest in the organization. That most basic idea that some of the turnover is perhaps good, isn't captured by one summarized metric like your turnover rate. And so as we think about really trying to get to a more analytic point of view, the very first place to start is just a relation of that not all turnover is bad. And so how does our turnover compare to our turnover of those people we definitely don't want to lose, our top talent? And so even breaking that type of information out can tell you whether or not this is an issue that you should be focusing on. So in this particular view, it's relating the overall turnover rates in blue to the top talent turnover rate for those different departments in green. And we can see that our overall turnover rate is generally higher than the turnover rate for our top talent, although we have some exception areas that we might want to go focus on to understand why they're losing more top talent than they are losing everybody else from the organization. And so this is your first starting point of, okay, so how do we get a little bit more sophisticated from an analysis point of view? So kind of analysis that we'd expect. But the question that generally follows from that is, assuming that you have that turnover is an issue, that really becomes the key that people want to focus on. It's not a case of, so much is turnover even an issue. More often the challenge is, yes, but why? And what can we do to change it? And that's another way to think about that transition to analytics from metrics, is you're getting at the why behind data. And so one of the things I always coach people with is that never forget that from your unique thing that you bring to the organization as somebody in the HR organization is your expertise as people. And so apply that. And so we know things related to people that often a lot of people don't. Old axioms like people don't often leave jobs, they leave their manager. These are things that we know and are intuitive to us. Apply that knowledge. And so here, it's just a simple cut trying to figure out, okay, what are the indicators that we might have for turnover? What patterns exist? And so we apply our knowledge. Let's relate resignation, in this case, to engagement, or let's relate resignation to tenure. Is there patterns here that are inherent? Part of now where technology, though, can help you, so part of the story here I would tell is that to the point that technology is at a lot of the heart here of with the gap to being successful, is statistical techniques or big data techniques can also really help you to do this in a much more sophisticated, much more powerful way. So the traditional approach would be very similar to what I've done and say, okay, let's just go look for these patterns that are hidden in data. Some of the big data approaches automate this discovery for you. In this particular case, it's a type of analysis that's using a clustering or a k-means in case there's any statisticians on the line, trying to call out and tease out a couple of axioms that we understand well as people focused on people. One is this notion of turnover contagion, that those people who leave the organization, they're at least informative, if not predictive, around who's likely to leave next. The other one is that old people axiom as well, which is don't just focus on your weaknesses, focus on your strengths. And so what it's calling out here in kind of the orange versus green is good is the orange side is what are those common characteristics shared behind the people that are leaving the organization. The idea being if you could figure out what those are, it can tell you where to focus. On the green side, it is what are the common characteristics shared by those people who are staying. The notion being that the contrast might be really powerful. Here in this, admittedly, sample of data that was used to power this one, we can see that it turns out that tenure is really strongly correlated with people leaving the organization. It appears that higher rates of tenure is correlated with people staying in the organization. So we might want to go focus on onboarding and our talent acquisition to say, look, are we bringing in people that are bad fit culturally? So these other types of things that might be good places for us to focus. And then finally, we can take these big data approaches even further and say, well, okay, if I understand why people are leaving, so I have some understanding of what are those trends, can I apply that back to people still in the organization, which would give me some insight of who's likely to leave next? Who should I be focusing on? And so if you imagine this transition now from going from a very metric, I can report out turnover in the organization, to now I can arm decision makers in the organization with the ability for them to understand what's at the heart of their attrition. 2, now I can tell them who they should be focusing on, who they should spend their time with, who they should do a skip level meeting with, or whatever the particular action would be, to make certain that these people are more engaged in the organization and we don't lose them. That's transitioning from this very report metric centric to now I can turn that insight into particular actions in my organization to try to create that impact that we've been talking about. So it's a good example for me where a lot of these ideas come together, visualization, data, and its application to give you practical ways that you can start to change. So what are the pitfalls then? So if that's all great and wonderful, how do we get there? What are the things in that journey that we need to be conscious of so that we don't, kind of what are the landmines, if you put it in those terms, that we should be conscious of so we don't step on them in our journey. So what are those things we need to watch out for? In other terms, the pitfalls. We see a lot of these. We talk to, I should probably personally talk to a good 200 analyst experts a year that are trying to make this difference in their organization. And there's a very common set of themes that come back to us, come back to even me literally, and that people use as either justification not to go ahead or just aren't certain about how to get past these. And one of the biggest ones that I hear is that our data isn't good enough. In fact, the way I often relate this is that almost everybody I talk to claims to me that their data is worse than everybody else's, which even the most basic statistics will tell you cannot be true. And yet everybody has that perception that, oh, yes, but we're special and unique because our data is so much worse. And so if you have that point of view, welcome to the statistical mean, or perhaps the median, and that you are just like everybody else. You are literally statistically normal. And so you're not alone if you have that point of view. And so what we find, though, is a lot of people use this as a reason that they cannot be successful. And what I always coach people is always remember that analytics is a journey. It's not a destination where you didn't have it, now you have it. It is a journey. Every new question leads to new questions, and every source of data has another human input upstream later, that means you're going to have some bad data entered into the system. And so it becomes a lifestyle of making certain that you're constantly living in a mode of, get ourselves to a better place with data. What can we do to make that replicable so that we can have consistency ongoing? And what is our next step in the journey to make certain it's even better next time? So don't think about it as something that you're just solve for. And what I often relate to people as well is that people get fixated on perfection. So if one part of it is remember it's a journey, the other part is perfection is never the destination. You don't reach perfection. And so be thoughtful on the decisions that you're making about focusing on data quality. And what I try to relate this with is the little diagram at the bottom of this slide. And what most people get fixated on is saying they ignore the impact of the decision dimension. And they say, I just got to go straight up to the top there in terms of the highest quality, regardless of the information, regardless of how it's being used, regardless of the decisions we're making with it. But be thoughtful of the application of that information, and that'll allow you to make the right trade-offs to say, this data is being used to make a fundamental business decision that will have long-term impacts to the entire success of the business. Yeah, get it right. But quite frankly, if you measured your let's go back to the granddaddy, turnover metrics for your organization. You measure turnover, and to the best of your knowledge, it was 17%, and it turned out the truth was it was 17.4. Would you really make a fundamental difference in your decision? So be thoughtful that you should always balance the quality and the effort you're putting into cleaning data against the impact of that a decision that you're making. Don't end up in that risky decision bucket, but try to avoid that inefficient bucket as well. And then lastly, to that notion on the, kind of again to that journey notion, aim for continuous improvement. And part of how you can do that is look at some of those upstream processes that have bad data entered into the system. The other side of it is the downstream. What can you do to put in just the rules that auto-correct for that? In my little stylized apple here for the big apple, is something as simple as the number of ways that people are going to enter into a system in New York. They're seemingly almost infinite. So if you can capture those with rules and translate them to say that whenever we refer to New York, it's New York, or it's New York City, that means that you can get to better quality data without the big maintenance overhead of throwing people at it. The other one then, quickly here, is that we hear is our IT department is far too busy. And so a lot of organizations we see taking a very traditional approach of saying, we're going to implement a big business intelligence solution, and that's going to follow the traditional path, and the IT is going to run that project, and they're going to implement it. What invariably follows is, and they've been saying that for years and haven't got to it, but maybe next year. And so there are different approaches that you can take. And so part of my advice is think about solutions rather than tools as a way to kind of mentally get your mind in that notion of there's better ways to solve this rather than having to build it all yourselves. Tools imply you have to apply the tools and build it. Solutions implies that you get something that solves your problem. And so look to modern user experiences and modern technologies, cloud, big data approaches. Challenge your vendors in terms of their expertise in what you're applying this to. If their expertise is limited to, and we're really good at charting, we're really good at manipulating data, that's great. But are they really great at understanding the questions that we have of our workforce? Are they great at understanding what it takes to clean data that's coming from an ATS joined with a NHRS system? And to that notion of that flexible data model, data is your first hurdle, and it's going to be one of the big ones. So make certain there's flexibility in the solutions that you're contemplating, as well as to the point of everybody has unique challenges with their data. They do have unique business goals, and you're going to want to make certain you have that flexibility. So with that, let me just kind of wrap up here a little bit in terms of the content I wanted to cover. So, the way that we kind of think about it in that kind of transition from that insight that you have, mapping that back into your kind of people priorities, your people strategy, so that you create that business impact. Think about the key questions that you need to empower for your organization that allow you to make that transformation. Think about the practical pieces on the hurdles, how to get past some of those hurdles, so that you can answer some of these more profound questions for your organization and make that transition to be less metric-centric, more analytical-centric, more insight to action or planning-centric, and ultimately make your organization more data-centric in the way that you make decisions around your people and the business impact that you create. With that, let me kind of pass the baton back or the mic back to Al.
Dave, outstanding insight. Super appreciate your perspective. One question, and to the audience, please feel free to bring your questions in. And in fact, if you want to be heard, I can unmute your line from here. So let me know via chat or via question if you'd like that to happen. So we'll have Dave for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we'll conclude about 5 minutes of the hour to let you all reflect or take action or get to your next meeting, whatever the case may be. But the first question I have for you, Dave, is when an organization or an analyst says my data isn't right, what I'm finding is more and more are asking, are we measuring the right things in the first place? Like, for example, you brought up the example of regrettable turnover. Is regrettable turnover even being measured in most organizations? So is that part of the coaching advisory that you do? And related to that, do you see many organizations being more proactive in formulating a measurement strategy, not only an analytics or planning strategy, but what are we measuring in the first place? Can you comment on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a big question actually, because there's a lot of pieces that relate to this. What we find is common pitfalls is people measure too much, right? The way I think about this is avoid it's interesting rather than it's impactful. And the distinction I make is if you cannot ask, how will we use this information to make a decision, don't measure it. Just don't. Because it'll distract, you'll get fixated on making the data perfect, you'll get distracted and you won't focus on what matters. So answer the basic questions. Who will use this information and what decisions they'll make with it? If you don't know that, don't bother measuring. So that's kind of a starting point. In quick answer to, and do we help organizations with that? Absolutely. And that's part of the extended service we provide, is to do that mapping of what are your business priorities to what should you actually measure about your people. And then, of course, fill in the technology piece as well to say, okay, and now we'll give you the ability to measure all of that. And so from a quality on the data perspective, it also relates to that notion too, that if you minimize what you're going to measure and focus on the things that are impactful, then you're also not trying to clean up everything in every corner. Mm-hmm. You can clean up the data that's going to relate to the things that are important to your organization. So it becomes a nice focusing lens as well to the project and making it successful.
Interesting. Now, I'm going to launch a poll right here, because what I hear you saying, you talked about both, or actually all, reporting, metrics, analytics, planning, all of them together. So you advocate, assuming a systematic approach as opposed to looking at these piecemeal. Is that a fair statement?
That it's more than a fair statement. It's one of our fundamental points of view. This idea that that you want, why do you do analytics? It's to make a better decision. Okay, so I've made a decision. How do I action the decision? Very simple kind of continuum here that you want to think about. And what we see is the keys to doing that are, yes, you need the analytics to make the right decisions. You need planning to action those decisions. That would be a simple summation of it.
Yeah, and despite that, many organizations and analysts or centers of expertise are being driven by leaders to, hey, we need better workforce planning, or we need better analytics. And leaders aren't necessarily taking that systematic approach that you just alluded to. Is there a way that you would coach the attendees on how to have that conversation? I think you just touched on it, but if you can elaborate, that'd be great.
Yeah, actually, a couple things come to mind. One is to the notion that I said on the quality of data. That's a journey. I mean, analytics is always a journey. One of the ways that you can get kind of more organizational buy-in success is cut the project apart. Pick something to focus on first. Make that successful. It has limited scope, and that success will get you the buy-in and perhaps even just funding or budget to get the next level of success. How do you pick that first thing? And what I would coach there is find a interested, engaged business leader and ask them a couple questions. First, what are your core business goals and priorities? Understand what they're trying to achieve from a business perspective. And then follow that up with, and how do people make a difference to that success? What is it about the people? And what is it about how do people impact that? From that, you should be able to translate that back to what are the key things that you're going to either measure or plan to make them more successful in their business goals and strategies. Because that's really the approach that you should be thinking of, rather than just blanketing, we're going to measure the standard HR metrics. And that success and that champion on the business side will get every other business leader going, and I want that too. So it's one of the approaches that I can see being very successful, or I've seen be very successful, where people haven't tried to boil the ocean, but rather have taken it piecemeal like that.
Okay, so there's a question that came in, Dave, that takes off of that. It's around BI tools that are currently in place, such as Cognos, MicroStrategy, Business Objects, and how does a cloud-based tool like Visier stand apart? How does it distinguish itself? And related to that, what's the value proposition that you would use internally to sell a tool like Visier?
Yeah, so the distinction I would make to those solutions, the two big ones I'll call out. I'll be succinct here. I'll try to be. There are two really big ones. There's hundreds I could call out, I suppose, but two that I'll focus on. First off, if you think about business intelligence tools, they are one piece of a puzzle. So what is the puzzle? The puzzle is we need to integrate our data together from the multiple systems. We need to put that into what's known as a data warehouse, a data mart. Then we implement what we talked about, which is the Cognos, pick your favorite tool, Cognos Business Objects, etc. And then the last piece of the puzzle is we apply it, and that we create reports and dashboards and the other standard business intelligence content. What we're trying to do with Visier is say, first off, give you all of that. So rather than have to think about those four separate steps, you only have to think about one thing. So it's a complete solution that, yes, we host and store and persist your data, so you don't have to worry about a data mart or a data warehouse. And yes, part of the service is the expertise to manage that integration of the data from all of those various different systems. But the most important one for me is actually the top of that puzzle that I talked about, the business questions. So what we deliver out of the box is the best practices that we do the hard research on, and we update that research 4 times a year to say these are the right leading edge questions that people should be asking about their workforce. And so it not only is a tool that I can make pretty charts, it's a solution that says we're going to start with the right business questions answered for you.
That's fantastic insight, fantastic coaching. One last question, if I may. You all are going to be presenting at HR Tech, if I'm not mistaken. I know you're going to be there. And you have a case study with Conagra that Burson is highlighting. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Actually, I just, previous to hopping on this line here for the webinar, I was talking to Mark Berry, who's responsible for overall people insights at Conagra Foods, and he'll be speaking at HR Tech. He's a fabulous speaker, and they've got an amazing story there at Conagra, in particular how they really transformed their approach and really also worked very closely in hand with finance, which I think is a really interesting story and a case study in terms of how they changed a lot of the way they approached thinking about things like total cost of their workforce, a type of business question that a lot of organizations aren't focusing on, are still focusing more on the traditional, acquisition or retention of talent. And so I encourage you all to attend that session and come check out our booth as well at HR Tech, and we'd love to have a conversation with you about what we're up to and some of the customer success that we can share with you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And since I have everybody on the line, please, if you are going to HR Tech, not only will Mark Berry be presenting and highlighting his use of Visier, but I'll be hosting the Meet the Expert session on workforce planning analytics. So please swing by that if you can. As we wrap up here, Dave, I super appreciate you making time today and sharing your insights and ideas and the accomplishments of Visier. It's very insightful and hopefully valuable to all who participated today. Any concluding remarks you'd like to make?
I think I've said a lot. So actually, let me just say thank you, and thank you to Al. Thanks for letting me have a forum here to chat with you and share some of our thinking. And as I often joke, most people's best questions come 5 minutes after the presentation ends. So don't be shy. You can see my email address there. If you do have a question, I'm happy to answer it offline for you as well.
Well, thank you all for attending today. And if you have any follow-up questions, please reach out to me or Dave, as he said, and wish you all a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.